Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another edition of History and Truth. Today, we are at the River Kwai View Hotel in Kanchanaburi, overlooking the bridge on the River Kwai and the prisoner of war camp of the Second World War. Today, we're talking about the Burma campaign in general. The Burma campaign was a series of battles fought in the British colony of Burma as part of the Southeast Asian theater of World War II. It primarily involved forces of the Allies, mainly from the British Empire and the Republic of China, with support from the United States, against the invading forces of the Empire of Japan. Imperial Japan was supported by the Thai Phaip Army, as well as two collaborationist independence movements and armies. Nominally independent puppet states were established in the conquered areas, and some territories were annexed by Thailand. In 1942 and 1943, the International Allied Force in British India launched several failed offensives to retake lost territories. Fighting intensified in 1944, and British Empire forces peaked at around 1 million land and air forces. These forces were drawn primarily from British India, with British Army forces equivalent to 8 regular infantry divisions and 6 tank regiments, 100,000 East and West African colonial troops, and smaller numbers of land and air forces from several other dominions and colonies. These additional forces allowed the Allied recapture of Burma in 1945. The campaign had a number of notable features. The geographical characteristics of the region meant that the weather, disease, and terrain had a major effect on operations. The lack of transport infrastructure placed an emphasis on military engineering and air transport to move and supply troops and evacuate wounded. The campaign was also politically complex, with the British, the United States, and the Chinese all having different strategic priorities. It was also the only land campaign by the Western Allies in the Pacific Theater, which proceeded continuously from the start of hostilities to the end of the war. This was due to its geographical location. By extending from Southeast Asia to India, its area included some lands which the British lost at the outset of the war, but also included areas of India wherein the Japanese advance was eventually stopped. The climate of the region is dominated by the seasonal monsoon rains, which allowed effective campaigning for only just over half of each year. This, together with other factors such as famine and disorder in British India, and the priority given by the Allies to the defeat of Nazi Germany, prolonged the campaign and divided it into 4 phases. The Japanese invasion, which led to the expulsion of the British, Indian, and Chinese forces in 1942. Failed attempts by the Allies to mount offensives into Burma from late 1942 to early 1944. The 1944 Japanese invasion of India, which ultimately failed following the battles of Imphal and Kohima. And finally, the successful Allied offensive, which liberated Burma from late 1944 to mid-1945. The campaign was also strongly affected from the political atmosphere which erupted in the Southeast Asian regions occupied by Japan, who pursued the Pan-Asianist policy of a Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. This led to a Japanese-sponsored revolution during the initial invasion and establishment of the state of Burma, whose Burma Independence Army had spearheaded the initial attacks against the country. The provisional government of pre-India, with its Indian National Army, fought under Imperial Japan, especially during Operation U-Go in 1944. The INA had earlier collaborated with Nazi Germany. The dominating attitude of the Japanese militarists who commanded the army stationed in the country ultimately doomed the co-prosperity sphere as a whole, leading to local hopes for real independence fading and a revolt by the Burma National Army in 1945. On the Allied side, political relations were mixed for much of the war. The China-Burma-India theater, American-trained Chinese exports led to cooperation between the two countries, but the clashing strategies proposed by General Joseph Stilwell and Chinese Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek would lead to Stilwell's eventual removal from his position as American commander of the theater. On the other hand, China-India relations were positive from the cooperative Burma Road, built to reach the Chinese Y force and the Chinese war effort inside China, as well as the heroic missions over the extremely dangerous air route over the Himalayas, nicknamed the Hump. The campaign would have a great impact on the independence struggle of Burma and India in the post-war years. The Japanese conquest of Burma. Japanese objectives in Burma were initially limited to the capture of Rangoon, now known as Yangon, the capital and principal seaport. This would close the overland supply line to China and provide a strategic bulwark to defend Japanese gains in British Malaya. Here's the Battle of Singapore. Here is the Malayan campaign. And the Dutch East Indies, which is now Indonesia. The Japanese 15th Army under Lieutenant General Shojiro Iida, initially consisting of only 2 infantry divisions, moved into northern Thailand, which had signed a treaty of friendship with Japan, and launched an attack over jungle-clad mountain ranges into the southern Burmese province of Tenasserim, now Tanantharayai region, in January 1942. In the face of the Japanese advances, huge numbers of Indians, Anglo-Indians, and Anglo-Burmese fled Burma, around 600,000 by the autumn of 1942. Perhaps 80,000 of those in flight would die from starvation, exhaustion, and disease. Some of the worst massacres in Burma during World War II would be perpetrated not by the Japanese, but by the Burmese gangs linked to the Burma Independence Army. The Japanese successfully attacked over the Kwakaryek Pass and captured the port of Mo Mine at the mouth of the Salween River after overcoming stiff resistance. They then advanced northwards, outflanking successive British defensive positions. Troops of the 17th Indian Infantry Division tried to retreat over the Sitang River, but Japanese parties reached the vital bridge before they did. On 22nd February, the bridge was demolished to prevent its capture, a decision that has since been extremely contentious. The loss of 2 brigades of 17th Indian Division meant that Rangoon could not be defended. General Archibald Wavell, the Commander-in-Chief of the American, British, Dutch, Australian Command, nevertheless ordered Rangoon to be held as he was expecting substantial reinforcements from the Middle East. Although some units arrived, counterattacks failed, and the new commander of the Burma army, who was General Harold Alexander, ordered the city to be evacuated on 7th March after its port and oil refinery had been destroyed. The remnants of the Burma army broke out to the north, narrowly escaping encirclement. On the eastern part of the front, in the Battle of the Yunnan-Burma Road, the Chinese 200th Division held up the Japanese for a time around Tonggu, but after its fall, the road was opened for motorized troops of the Japanese 56th Division to shatter the Chinese 6th Army to the east in the Karenni states and advance northward through the Shan states to capture Lashio, outflanking the Allied defensive lines and cutting off the Chinese armies from Yunnan. With the effective collapse of the entire defensive line, there was little choice left other than an overland retreat to India or to Yunnan. The Japanese advanced to the Indian frontier. After the fall of Rangoon in March 1942, the Allies attempted to make a stand in the north of the country, Upper Burma, having been reinforced by a Chinese expeditionary force. The Japanese had also been reinforced by 2 divisions made available by the capture of Singapore, and defeated both the newly organized Burma Corps and the Chinese force. The Allies were also faced with growing numbers of Burmese insurgents, and the civil administration broke down in the areas they still held. With their forces cut off from almost all sources of supply, the Allied commanders finally decided to evacuate their forces from Burma. On 16th April, in Burma, 7,000 British soldiers were encircled by the Japanese 33rd Division during the Battle of Yanang-Yuan, and rescued by the Chinese 38th Division. The retreat was conducted in very difficult circumstances. Starving refugees, disorganized stragglers, and the sick and wounded clogged the primitive roads and tracks leading to India. Burma Corps managed to make it most of the way to Imphal in Manipur in India, just before the monsoon broke in May 1942. So the retreat came all the way back up here to Imphal. Now they had lost most of their equipment and transport. There they found themselves living out in the open under torrential rains in extremely unhealthy circumstances. The army and civil authorities in India were very slow to respond to the needs of the troops and civilian refugees. Due to lack of communication, when the British retreated from Burma, almost none of the Chinese knew about the retreat. Realizing that they could not win without British support, some of X-Force, committed by Chiang Kai-shek, made a hasty and disorganized retreat to India, where they were put under the command of American General Joseph Stilwell. After recuperating, they were re-equipped and retrained by American instructors. The rest of the Chinese troops tried to return to Yunnan through remote mountainous forests, and of these, at least half died. The Thai army enters Burma. Here is information about the Phayap army. In accordance with the Thai military alliance with Japan that was signed on 21st December 1941, on 21st March, the Thais and Japanese also agreed that Karenni state and Shan states, here in the north, were to be under Thai control. The rest of Burma was to be under Japanese control. The leading elements of the Thai Phayap Army under J.R. Serirong crossed the border into the Shan states in 10th May 1942. 3 Thai infantry divisions and 1 cavalry division, spearheaded by armored reconnaissance groups and supported by the Royal Thai Air Force, engaged the retreating Chinese 93rd Division. Keng Tong, the main objective, here, was captured on 27th May. On 12th July, General Fin Chun Haven, who would become the Thai military governor of the occupied Shan state, to occupy Karenni state, ordered the 3rd Division of the Phayap Army from the southern part of the Shan state to occupy Karenni state and expelled the Chinese 55th Division from Loi Khao. The Chinese troops could not retreat because the routes to Yunnan were controlled by Axis forces, and many Chinese soldiers were captured. The Thais remained in control of the Shan states for the remainder of the war. Their troops suffered from supply shortages and disease, but were not subjected to Allied attacks. Allied setbacks, 1942 to 1943. The Japanese did not renew their offensive after the monsoon ended. They installed a nominally independent Burmese government under Ba Maw and reformed the Burma Independence Army on a more regular basis and the Burma National Army under General Aung San. In practice, both government and army were strictly controlled by the Japanese authorities. Here are some of the very muddy conditions that were experienced by the troops at this time. On the Allied side, operations in Burma over the remainder of 1942 and 1943 were a study of military frustration. Britain could only maintain 3 active campaigns, and immediate offensives in both the Middle East and Far East proved impossible through lack of resources. The Middle East was accorded priority, being closer to home and in accordance with the Germany First policy in London and Washington. The Allied buildup was also hampered by the disordered state of eastern Burma at the time. There were violent Quit India protests in Bengal and Bihar. Bihar is now referred to as Rakhine state, which required large numbers of British troops to suppress. There was also a disastrous famine in Bengal, which may have led to 3 million deaths through starvation, disease, and exposure. In such conditions of chaos, it was difficult to improve the inadequate lines of communication to the front line in Assam or make use of the local industries for the war effort. Efforts to improve the training of Allied troops took time, and in forward areas, poor morale and endemic disease combined to reduce the strength and effectiveness of the fighting units. Nevertheless, the Allies mounted 2 operations during the 1942-1943 dry season. The first was a small offensive into the coastal Arakan province of Burma. The Indian Eastern Army intended to reoccupy the Mayu Peninsula and Akyab Island, which had an important airfield. A division advanced to Dombaik, only a few miles from the end of the peninsula, but was halted by a small but well-entrenched Japanese force. At this stage of the war, the Allies lacked the means and tactical ability to overcome strongly constructed Japanese bunkers. Repeated British and Indian attacks failed with heavy casualties. Japanese reinforcements arrived from central Burma and crossed rivers and mountain ranges which the Allies had declared to be impassable. To hit the Allies' exposed left flank and overrun several units. The exhausted British were unable to hold any defensive lines and were forced to abandon much equipment and fall back almost to the Indian frontier. The second action was controversial. Under the command of Brigadier Ord Wingate, a long-range penetration unit known as the Chindits infiltrated through the Japanese front lines and marched deep into Burma with the initial aim of cutting the main north-south railway in Burma in an operation codenamed Operation Longcloth. Some 3,000 men entered Burma in many columns. They damaged communications of the Japanese in northern Burma, cutting the railway for possibly 2 weeks, but they suffered heavy casualties. This is the insignia of the Chindits. Though the results were questioned, the operation was used to propaganda effect, particularly to insist that British and Indian soldiers could live, move, and fight as effectively as the Japanese in the jungle, doing much to restore morale among Allied troops. The balance shifts, 1943 to 1944. From December 1943 to November 1944, the strategic balance of the Burma campaign shifted decisively. Improvements in Allied leadership, training, and logistics, together with greater firepower and growing Allied air superiority, gave Allied forces a confidence that had previously lacked. In the Arakan, 15th Indian Corps withstood and then broke a Japanese counterstrike, while the Japanese invasion of India resulted in unbearably heavy losses and the ejection of the Japanese back beyond the Chinwon River. Here is Lord Louis Mountbatten, Supreme Allied Commander, seen during his tour of the Arakan Front in February 1944. Allied plans. In August 1943, the Allies created Southeast Asia Command, SEAC, a new combined command responsible for the Southeast Asian theater under Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten. The training, equipment, health, and morale of Allied troops under British 14th Army under Lieutenant General William Slim was improving, as was the capacity of the lines of communication in northeastern India. An innovation was the extensive use of aircraft to transport and supply troops. SEAC had to accommodate several rival plans, many of which had to be dropped for lack of resources. Amphibious landings on the Andaman Islands, which was called Operation Pigstick, and in Arakan were abandoned, while the landing craft were recalled to Europe in preparation for the Normandy landings. The major effect was intended to be by American-trained Chinese troops of Northern Combat Area Command, NCAC, under Stilwell, to cover the construction of the Lido Road. Ord Wingate had controversially gained approval for a greatly expanded Chindit force, which was given the task of assisting Stilwell by disrupting the Japanese lines of supply to the northern front. Chiang Kai-shek had also agreed reluctantly to mount an offensive from Yunnan. Under British 14th Army, the Indian 15th Corps prepared to renew the advance in Arakan province, while Fourth Corps launched a tentative advance from Imphal to the center of the Long Front to distract Japanese attention from the other objectives. Japanese plans. About the same time that SEAC was established, the Japanese created the Burma Area Army under Lieutenant General Masakazu Kawabe, which took under command the 15th Army and the newly formed 28th Army. This is Lieutenant General Kawabe, who is the commander of the Japanese Burma Area Army. The new commander of the 15th Army, Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi, was keen to mount an offensive against India. Burma Area Army originally quashed this idea, but found that their superiors at Southern Expeditionary Army Group headquarters in Singapore were keen on it. While the staff at Southern Expeditionary Army were persuaded that the plan was inherently risky, they in turn found that the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo was in favor of Mutaguchi's plan. The Japanese were influenced to an unknown degree by Subhas Chandra Bose. Looks like Bose, but Bose, who was commander of the Indian National Army. This was composed largely of Indian soldiers who had been captured in Malaya or Singapore, and Indians or Tamils living in Malaya. At Bosch's instigation, a substantial contingent of the INA joined in this Chalo Delhi, March on Delhi, with the war cry, Jai Hind, which means long live India, even though they were traitors. Both Bosch and Mutaguchi emphasized the advantages which would be gained by a successful attack into India, with misgivings on the part of several of Mutaguchi's superiors and subordinates. Operation Yugo was launched. Northern and Yunnan Front, 1943 to 1944. Stilwell's forces, designated X-Force, initially consisted of 2 American-equipped Chinese divisions with a Chinese-manned M3 light tank battalion and an American long-range penetration brigade known as Merrill's Marauders. In 1943, the Thai Phayat Army invasion headed to Xishuangbanna at China, but were driven back by the nationalist Chinese force. Here are Merrill Marauders boarding an aircraft. This is the India-China airlift that delivered approximately 650,000 tons of material to China at a cost of 1,659 men and 594 aircraft. This is the hump. In October 1943, the Chinese 38th Division, led by Sun Li-jen, began to advance from Ledo, Assam, towards Myitkyina and Mogwong, where American engineers and Indian laborers extended the Ledo Road behind them. The Japanese 18th Division was repeatedly outflanked by the Marauders and threatened with encirclement. Here is another monument to the Chindits. In Operation Thursday, the Chindits were to support Stilwell by interdicting Japanese communications in the region of Indao. A brigade began marching across the Pak Kai Mountains on 5th February 1944. In early March, 3 other brigades were flown into landing zones behind Japanese lines by the Royal Air Force and the USAAF, and established defensive strongholds around Indao. Meanwhile, the Chinese forces on the Yunnan front, Y Force, mounted an attack starting in the second half of April, with nearly 75,000 troops crossing the Salween River on a 300-kilometer, 190-mile front. Soon, some 12 Chinese divisions of 175,000 men under General Wang Lihuang were attacking the Japanese 56th Division. The Japanese forces in the north were now fighting on two fronts in northern Burma. On 17th May, control of the Chindits passed from Slim to Stilwell. Here is General Stilwell. The Chindits now moved from the Japanese rear areas to new bases closer to Stilwell's front, and were given additional tasks by Stilwell for which they were not equipped. They achieved several objectives, but at the cost of heavy casualties. By the end of June, they had linked up with Stilwell's forces, but were exhausted and were withdrawn to India. Also on 17th May, a force of two Chinese regiments, Unit Galahad, which are Merrill's Marauders, and Kachin guerrillas, captured the airfield at Mitkina. The Allies did not immediately follow up the success, and the Japanese were able to reinforce the town, which fell only after a siege that lasted until 3rd August. The capture of Mitkina airfield, nevertheless, immediately helped to secure the air link from India to Chongqing over the hump. By the end of May, the Yunnan offensive, though hampered by the monsoon rains and lack of air support, succeeded in annihilating the garrison of Tengchong and eventually reached as far as Longling. Strong Japanese reinforcements then counterattacked and halted the Chinese advance. Southern Front, 1943 to 1944. In Arakan, Indian 15th Corps under Lieutenant General Philip Christensen renewed the advance on the Mayu Peninsula. Ranges of steep hills channeled the advance into 3 attacks, each by an Indian or West African division. The 5th Indian Infantry Division captured the small port of Mong Dao on 9th January 1944. The Corps then prepared to capture 2 railway tunnels linking Mong Dao with the Kalpan Zin Valley, but the Japanese struck first. A strong force from the Japanese 55th Division infiltrated Allied lines to attack the 7th Indian Infantry Division from the rear, overrunning the divisional headquarters. This is coming up to the Battle of the Admin Box. Here we see the tourist train going over the bridge on the River Kwai, proceeding off in the distance. Unlike previous occasions on which this had happened, the Allied forces stood firm against the attack and supplies were dropped to them by parachute. In the Battle of the Admin Box from 5th to 23rd February, the Japanese concentrated on 15 Corps administrative area, defended mainly by a line of communication troops, but they were unable to deal with tanks supporting the defenders, while troops from the 5th Indian Division broke through the Nyak Kyoy Dok Pass to relieve the defenders of the box. Although the battle casualties were approximately equal, the result was a heavy Japanese defeat. Their infiltration and encirclement tactics has failed to panic Allied troops, and the Japanese were unable to capture enemy supplies. They starved. Over the next few weeks, 15 Corps offensive ended as the Allies concentrated on the Central Front. After capturing the railway tunnels, 15 Corps halted during the monsoon. The Japanese invasion of India, 1944. 4th Corps under Lieutenant General Jeffrey Scoons had pushed forward 2 divisions to the Chindwin River. The Chindwin is here. One division was in reserve at Imphal in Manipur. There were indications that a major Japanese offensive was building. Slim and Scoons planned to withdraw and force the Japanese to fight with their logistics stretched beyond the limit. However, they misjudged the date on which the Japanese were to attack and the strength they would use against some objectives. The Japanese 15th Army consisted of 3 infantry divisions and a brigade-sized detachment, the Yamamoto Force, and initially a regiment from the Indian National Army. Mutaguchi, the army commander, planned to cut off and destroy the forward divisions of 4 Corps before capturing Imphal, while the Japanese 31st Division isolated Imphal by capturing Kohima. Imphal. Mutaguchi intended to exploit the capture of Imphal by capturing the strategic city of Dimapur in the Brahmaputra River Valley. If this could be achieved, the lines of communication to General Stilwell's forces and air bases used to supply the Chinese over the hump would be cut. Remember, the hump is here. If they get here, they cut the hump. The Japanese troops crossed the Chindwin River on 8th March. Scoons and Slim were slow to order their forward troops to withdraw, and the 17th Indian Infantry Division was cut off at Tidin. It fought its way back to Imphal with aid from Scoons' Reserve Division, supplied by parachute drops. North of Imphal, 50th Indian Parachute Brigade was defeated at Sangshak by a regiment from the Japanese 31st Division on its way to Kohima. Imphal was thus left vulnerable to an attack by the Japanese 15th Division from the north, but because the diversionary attack launched by the Japanese in Arakan had already been defeated, Slim was able to move the 5th Indian Division by air to the Central Front. 2 brigades went to Imphal. The other went to Dimapur, from where it sent a detachment to Kohima. By the end of the first week of April, 4th Corps had concentrated in the Imphal plain. The Japanese launched several offensives during the month, which were repulsed. At the start of May, Slim and Scoons began a counteroffensive against the Japanese 15th Division north of Imphal. Progress was slow, as movement was made difficult by monsoon rains, and 4 Corps was short of supplies. Also, at the beginning of April, the Japanese 31st Division under Lieutenant General Kotaku Sato reached Kohima. And here's information about the Battle of Kohima. Instead of isolating the small British garrison there and pressing on with his main force to Dimapur, Sato chose to capture the hill station. The siege lasted from 5th to 18th April, where the exhausted defenders were relieved. A new formation HQ, the Indian 33rd Corps, under Lieutenant General Montague Stopford, now took over operations on this front. The 2nd British Infantry Division began a counteroffensive, and by 15th May, they had prized the Japanese off Kohima Ridge itself. After a pause, during which more Allied reinforcements arrived, 33rd Corps renewed its offensive. Here is a picture of soldiers of two wings of the 14th Army linking up at milestone 109 during the Battle of Imphal Kohima. One of the major factors at the Battle of Kohima was that Allied forces carried a tank through the forests to be placed on top of the hill, which broke the battle in favor for the Allies. By now, the Japanese were at the end of their endurance. Their troops, particularly 15th and 31st Divisions, were starving, and during the monsoon, disease spread rapidly among them. Lieutenant General Sato had notified Mutaguchi that his division would withdraw from Kohima at the end of May if it were not supplied. In spite of orders to hold on, Sato did indeed retreat. The leading troops of 4 Corps and 33rd Corps met at milestone 109, again here, on the Dimapur-Imphal Road on 22nd June. This is a view of the Garrison Hill battlefield. This was the key to the British defenses at Kohima. In particular, the tennis court was the heaviest fought area, where the tank carried through the jungle rather than driven through the jungle was the key point. Mutaguchi and Kawabe continued to order renewed attacks. 33rd Division and Yamamoto Force made repeated efforts, but by the end of June, they had suffered so many casualties, both from battle and disease, that they were unable to make any progress. The Imphal operation was finally broken off early in July, and the Japanese retreated painfully to the Chinwin River. Here are British soldiers celebrating some of their war booty after the battle. It was the greatest defeat to that date in Japanese history. They had suffered 50 to 60,000 dead and 100,000 or more casualties. Most of these losses were the result of disease, malnutrition, and exhaustion. The Allies suffered 12,500 casualties, including 2,269 killed. Mutaguchi had already relieved all his division's commanders and was himself subsequently relieved of command. This is the Imphal War Cemetery. During the monsoon, from August to November, 14th Army pursued the Japanese to the Chinwin River, while the 11th East Africa Division advanced down the Kabao Valley from Tamu. The 5th Indian Division advanced along the mountainous Tidum Road. By the end of November, Kalewa had been recaptured, and several bridgeheads were established on the east bank of the Chinwin. Allies' capture of Burma, 1944 to 1945. Here, Indian troops are wading ashore at Akyab in January 1945. The Allies launched a series of offensive operations into Burma during late 1944 and the first half of 1945. The command of the front was rearranged in November 1944. 11th Army Group HQ was replaced by Allied Land Forces Southeast Asia, and NCAC and 15 Corps were placed directly under this new headquarters. Although the Allies were still attempting to complete the Ledo Road, it was apparent that it would not materially affect the course of the war in China. The Japanese also made major changes in their command. The most important was the replacement of General Kawabe at the Burma Area Army by Hyotaro Kimura. Kimura threw Allied plans into confusion by refusing to fight at the Chinwon River. Recognizing that most of his formations were weak and short of equipment, he withdrew his forces behind the Irrawaddy River, forcing the Allies to greatly extend their lines of communication. Southern Front, 1944 to 1945. In Arakan, here, 15th Corps resumed its advance on Akyab Island, which is now called Sitwe, for the third year in succession. This time the Japanese were far weaker and retreated before the steady Allied advance. They evacuated Akyab Island, Sitwe Island now, on 31st December 1944. It was occupied by 15th Corps without resistance on 3rd January 1945 as part of Operation Talon, the amphibious landing at Akyab. Landing craft had now reached the theater, and 15th Corps launched amphibious attacks on the Maibon Peninsula on 12th January 1945, and at Kangao 10 days later during the Battle of Hill 170 to cut off the retreating Japanese. There was severe fighting until the end of the month, in which the Japanese suffered heavy casualties. An important objective for 15th Corps was the capture of Ramri Island and Chiduba Island to construct airfields which would support the Allied operations in central Burma. Most of the Japanese garrison died during the Battle of Ramri Island, mostly eaten by crocodiles. 15th Corps operations on the mainland were curtailed to release transport aircraft to support 14th Army. Northern Front, 1944 to 1945. NCAC resumed its advance late in 1944, although it was progressively weakened by the flyout of Chinese troops to the main front in China. On 10th December 1944, the 36th British Infantry Division on NCAC's right flank made contact with the units of 14th Army near Indao in northern Burma. 5 days later, Chinese troops on the command's left flank captured the city of Bamel. NCAC made contact with Chiang's Yunnan armies on 21st January 1945, and the Ledo Road could finally be completed, although by this point in the war its value was uncertain. Chiang ordered the American General Daniel Isam Sultan, commanding NCAC, to halt his advance at Lashio, which was captured on 7th March. This was a blow to British plans, as it endangered prospects of reaching Rangoon before the onset of the monsoon, expected at the beginning of May. Winston Churchill, British Prime Minister, appealed directly to American Chief of Staff George Marshall for the transport aircraft which had been assigned to NCAC to remain in Burma. From 1st April, NCAC's operations stopped, and its units returned to China and India. A US-led guerrilla force, OSS Detachment 101, took over the remaining military responsibilities of NCAC. Central Front, 1944 to 1945. The 14th Army, now consisting of 4th Corps and the 33rd Corps, made the main offensive effort into Burma, although the Japanese retreat over the Irrawaddy forced the Allies to completely change their plans. Such was the Allies' material superiority that this was done. 4th Corps was switched in secret from the right to the left flank of the army and aimed to cross the Irrawaddy near Pakoku and seize the Japanese line of communication center of Miktila, while 33rd Corps continued to advance on Mandalay. Here is an RAF Hawker Hurricane here, Mark 2C, flying alongside Ava Bridge, which spans the Irrawaddy River near Mandalay, Burma, during a low-level reconnaissance sortie in March 1945. Looks like this bridge, but it's not. During January and February 1945, 33rd Corps seized crossings over the Irrawaddy River near Mandalay. There was heavy fighting, which attracted Japanese reserves and fixed their attention. Late in February, the 7th Indian Division, leading 4th Corps, seized crossings at Nyangao near Pakoku. 17th Indian Division and 255th Indian Tank Brigade followed them across and struck for Miktila, in the open terrain of central Burma. This force outmaneuvered the Japanese and fell on Miktila on 1st March. The town was captured in 4 days, despite resistance to the last man. The Japanese tried first to relieve the garrison at Miktila and then to recapture the town and destroy its defenders. Their attacks were not properly coordinated and were repulsed. By the end of March, the Japanese had suffered heavy casualties and lost most of their artillery, their chief anti-tank weapon. They broke off the attack and retreated to Kyaube. 33rd Corps had renewed its attack on Mandalay. It fell to the 19th Indian Division on the 20th of March, though the Japanese held the former citadel, which the British called Fort Dufferin, for another week. Here's Fort Dufferin under aerial attack during World War II. Much of the historically and culturally significant portions of Mandalay were burned to the ground. There's Mandalay Palace. And the center of that was referred to as Fort Dufferin. The race for Rangoon. Though the Allied force had advanced successfully into central Burma, it was vital to capture the port of Rangoon before the monsoon to avoid a logistics crisis. In the spring of 1945, the other factor in the race for Rangoon was the years of preparation by the liaison organization Force 136, which resulted in a national uprising within Burma and the defection of the entire Burma National Army to the Allied side. In addition to the Allied advance, the Japanese now faced open rebellion behind their lines. Here is an M3 Stuart of an Indian cavalry regiment during the advance on Rangoon, April 1945. "33rd Corps mounted 14th Army's secondary drive down the Irrawaddy River Valley against stiff resistance from the Japanese 28th Army. 4th Corps made the main attack down the Railway Valley, which was also followed by the Sitang River. They began by striking at a Japanese delaying position held by the remnants of the Japanese 33rd Army at Kyaube. The attackers were initially halted by a strong defensive position behind a dry waterway, but a flanking move by tanks and mechanized infantry struck the Japanese from the rear and shattered them. Here is the entrance to one of the disused railway tunnels on the Myeongdao-Butdaung Road, captured by Allied troops in March 1944. From this point, the advance down the main road to Rangoon faced little organized opposition. An uprising by Karen guerrillas prevented troops from the reorganized Japanese 15th Army from reaching the major road center of Twangu before 4th Corps captured it. The leading Allied troops met Japanese rearguards north of Bago, 40 miles or 64 kilometers north of Rangoon. On 25th April, Heitaro Kimura had formed the various service troops, naval personnel, and even Japanese civilians in Yangon into the 105th Independent Mixed Brigade. This scratch formation held up the British advance until 30th April and covered the evacuation of the Rangoon area. Operation Dracula. The original conception of the plan to retake Burma had envisaged 15th Corps making an amphibious assault on Rangoon well before 14th Army reached the capital in order to ease supply problems. This operation, codenamed Operation Dracula, was postponed several times as the necessary landing craft were retained in Europe and finally dropped in favor of an attack on Phuket Island off the west coast of Thailand. Slim feared that the Japanese would defend Rangoon to the last man through the monsoon, which would put 14th Army in a disastrous supply situation. He therefore asked for Operation Dracula to be remounted at short notice. The naval forces for the attack on Phuket were diverted to Operation Dracula, and units of 15 Corps were embarked from Akyab and Ram Reef. On May 1st, a Gurkha parachute battalion was dropped on Elephant Point and cleared the Japanese rear guards from the mouth of the Yangon River. The 26th Indian Infantry Division landed by ship the next day. When they arrived, they discovered that Kimura had ordered Rangoon to be evacuated, starting on 22nd April. After the Japanese withdrawal, Yangon had experienced an orgy of looting and lawlessness, similar to the last days of the British in the city in 1942. On the afternoon of 2nd May 1945, the monsoon rains began in full force. The Allied drive to liberate Rangoon before the rains had succeeded with only a few hours to spare. The leading troops of 17th and 26th Indian Divisions met at Pligu, 28 miles or 45 kilometers north of Rangoon, on May 6th. Final operations. After the Allies captured Rangoon, a new 12th Army headquarters was created from 33rd Corps headquarters to take control of the formations which were to remain in Burma. Here is Lieutenant General Kawada, commander of the Japanese 31st Division, surrendering to Major General Arthur W. Crother, DSO, commander of the 17th Indian Division near Mole Mine, Burma. The Japanese 28th Army, after withdrawing from Arakan and resisting 33rd Corps to the Irrawaddy Valley, retreated into the Pegu Yomas, a range of low jungle-covered hills between the Irrawaddy and Sitang rivers. They planned to break out and rejoin Burma Area Army. To cover this breakout, Kimura ordered 33rd Army to mount a diversionary offensive across the Sitang, although the entire army could not muster the strength of barely a regiment. On 3rd July, they attacked the British positions in the Sitang Bend. On 10th July, after a battle for a country which was almost entirely flooded, both the Japanese and the Allies withdrew. There's the Battle of the Sitang Bend. The Japanese had attacked too early. Sakurai's 28th Army was not ready to start the breakout until 17th July. The breakout was a disaster. The British had placed ambushes or artillery concentrations on the routes the Japanese were to use. Hundreds of men drowned trying to cross the swollen Setang on improvised bamboo floats and rafts. Burmese guerrillas and bandits killed stragglers east of the river. The breakout cost the Japanese nearly 10,000 men, half the strength of 28th Army. British and Indian casualties were minimal. 14th Army, now under Lieutenant General Miles Dempsey, and 15th Corps had returned to India to plan the next stage of the campaign to retake Southeast Asia. A new corps, the Indian 34th Corps, under Lieutenant General Overy Linfield Roberts, was raised and assigned to 14th Army for further operations. This was to be an amphibious assault on the western side of Malaya, codenamed Operation Zipper. The surrender of Japan forestalled this operation, but it was undertaken post-war as the quickest way of getting occupation troops into Malaya. Results. Generally, the recovery of Burma is reckoned as a triumph for the British Indian Army and resulted in the greatest defeat the Japanese had suffered to that date. The attempted Japanese invasion of India in 1944 was launched on an unrealistic premises, as after the Singapore debacle and the loss of Burma in 1942, the British were bound to defend India at all costs. A successful invasion by Japanese imperial forces would have been disastrous. The defense operations at Kohima and Imphal in 1944 have since taken on huge symbolic value as the turning of the tide in British fortunes in the war in the East. The American historian Raymond Callahan concluded Slim's great victory helped the British, unlike the French, Dutch, or later the Americans, to leave Asia with some dignity. After the war ended, a combination of the pre-war agitation among the Bamar population for independence and the economic ruin of Burma during the 4-year campaign made it impossible for the former regime to be resumed. Within 3 years, both Burma and India were independent. American goals in Burma had been to aid the nationalist Chinese regime. Apart from the Hump airlift, these bore no fruit until so near the end of the war that they made little contribution to the defeat of Japan. These efforts have also been criticized as fruitless because of the self-interest and corruption of Chiang Kai-shek's regime. Here is the Union Jack being raised over a Mandalay Palace